You think Dick Cheney is wrong? He doesn't know what he's doing. He's maniacal. Well, you're certainly right about today's Dick Cheney, but you were not right about the Dick Cheney of yesteryear. And, you know, looking back on the tapes from 94, 92, and some of the older tapes of Dick Cheney, you know what I remembered? Dick Cheney actually was not that bad as Secretary of Defense. I know people are going to flip out over that, but he really wasn't. He was, in fact, I think he was a good Secretary of Defense. Much, much better than Don Rumsfeld was in this administration. That's for damn sure. Here's my thesis. I think Dick Cheney and George Bush lost their minds. Now, it seems controversial, but I'm going to prove it. Now, you're going to watch a speech of Dick Cheney's. It's about 4 minutes long. I think it's good, so we're going to give you the whole thing here. Explain why they didn't go into Iraq back in 91 when he was the Secretary of Defense. Now, we showed you a similar speech in 94. This is not the same one. This is a different one from 92. Listen to how right Dick Cheney was. Go ahead.
Well, that's a question that I'm frequently asked. Let me spend a minute on it, Ted, because it's an important subject. At the end of the war in the Gulf, when we made the decision to stop, we did so because we had achieved our military objectives. That is, when we decided to halt military operations. And those objectives were twofold: to liberate Kuwait, and secondly, to strip Saddam Hussein of his offensive military capability, of his capacity to threaten his neighbors, and we've done that. There's no doubt in my mind but what we could have gone on to Baghdad and taken Baghdad, occupied the whole country. We had the 101st Airborne up on the Euphrates River Valley, about halfway between Kuwait and Baghdad. And I don't think from a military perspective that it would have been an impossible task. Clearly it wouldn't, given the forces that we had there. But we made a very conscious decision not to proceed for several reasons. In part because as soon as you go to Baghdad to get Saddam Hussein, you have to recognize that you're undertaking a fairly complex operation. It's not the kind of situation where we could have pulled up in front of the presidential palace in Baghdad and said, "Come on, Saddam, you're going to the slammer." We would have had to run him to ground. A lot of places he could have gone to hide out or to resist. It would have required extensive military forces to achieve that. But let's assume for the moment that we would have been able to do it. We've got Saddam now, and maybe we put him down there in Miami with Noriega. Then the question comes, putting a government in place of the one you've just gotten rid of. You can't just sort of turn around and walk away. You've now accepted the responsibility for what happens in Iraq. What kind of government do you want us to create in place of the old Saddam Hussein government? You want a Sunni government or a Shia government? Or maybe it ought to be a Kurdish government? Or maybe one based on the Ba'ath Party? Or maybe some combination of all of those? How long is that government likely to survive without U.S. military forces there to keep it propped up? If you get into the business of committing U.S. forces on the ground in Iraq to occupy the place, my guess is I'd probably still have people there today instead of having been able to bring them home. We would have been in a situation once we went into Baghdad where we would have engaged in the kind of street-by-street, house-to-house fighting in an urban setting that would have been dramatically different from what we were able to do in the Gulf, in Kuwait, in the desert, where our precision-guided munitions and our long-range artillery and tanks were so devastating against those Iraqi forces. You would have been fighting in a built-up urban area, large civilian population, and much heavier prospects for casualties. You would have found as well, I think, probably the disintegration of the Arab coalition that signed on to support us in our efforts to eject the Iraqis from Kuwait, but never signed on for the proposition that the United States would become some kind of quasi-permanent occupier of a major Middle Eastern nation. And the final point, with respect to casualties, everybody, of course, was tremendously impressed with the fact that we were able to prevail at such a low cost, given the predictions with respect to casualties in major modern warfare. But for the 146 Americans who were killed in action, and for their families, it was not a cheap or a low-cost conflict. The bottom line question for me was, how many additional American lives is Saddam Hussein worth? The answer, not very damn many. I think the President got it right both times, both when he decided to use military force to defeat Saddam Hussein's aggression, but also when he made what I think was a very wise decision to stop military operations when we did.
How right was he? I mean, that's a smart guy. That's a guy who understands the consequences of his actions. That's a guy who predicted almost word for word what would happen in Iraq when we went in. What happened to that Dick Cheney? And how did he turn into this Dick Cheney? The one who's absolutely wrong, insistently wrong. And what's amazing is, this is not some other person speaking that Cheney was listening to. He was the one speaking. He knew what was going to go wrong in Iraq, and he went in there anyway with no preparation for any of this stuff. Now he's pushing to go into Iran. And no way 1992 Dick Cheney he didn't even consider Iraq, let alone Iran. I mean, Iran is madness. Iran is 4 times as large as Iraq, and we don't have any of the army we had when we were going into Iraq. Our armies, all our generals keep saying they're nearly broken, and he wants to take that army and bring them into Iran? I think Dick Cheney lost his mind. I do. At some point, I think something went wrong with him, and others say this too. People who've known him their whole lives say this. Something has gone wrong with Dick Cheney.